Okay, I think we will, sorry about that. I think we'll gradually get going. It's very encouraging that there's so many people literally standing room only. I hope you're all rested and refueled after your lunch. My name is Gus Tugendhat, and I'm the founder of a UK SME, a scale-up called Tussell. We're an information business, and we've become the market's go-to source of data and insight on UK government contracts, public procurement, which I always like to think of as the biggest market hiding in plain sight. Nobody really talks about it much, probably more at an event like this than commonly. But public procurement is 1/3 of all government spending, and it's about 10% of UK GDP. And until I set up this business, it was very hard to find a single source of truth on who was buying what from whom and at what cost. And that's the problem that we set out to solve. And I guess my kind of obsession, if you like, with data might owe something to the fact that SVP invited me to chair this session, the title of which is Understanding the Data. Most other rooms have a table between us and you. Our table doesn't. And Nathan commented that he thought it, as befits the exposing nature of a session on data. There we go. I'm stealing his joke. We've got an hour, of which the last kind of 20 minutes or so are going to be kind of Q&A, hopefully from all of you in the room, and maybe a few online to save any blushes if there aren't any in the room. But beforehand, the session will kind of unfold more or less as follows. We have a wonderful panel here today, Caroline, Rob, Tricia, and Nathan, and I'm going to ask them initially all just to introduce themselves for a minute or two and tell you a bit more about themselves. Then we're going to roll into 2 questions. The first question is going to be a slightly more kind of abstract talking point about what I'm calling the uses and abuses of data. When was the last time the panel was kind of on the receiving end of some data or presenting it and it was controversial, or it was painful, or it was well received or badly received, it was useful or not? I think everybody in this room will have had some experience along those lines. And the panel kind of, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, the uses and abuses of data. And then we'll roll into a second round of questions, all about a specific example of data. I've deployed some data from our company on public sector engagement with SMEs as measured by how much the wider public sector procures from SMEs. That's only one very narrow way of looking at government engagement with SMEs, but it's solid and definable. So I'm going to bring up a slide about that, and I'm going to invite the panel to critique it, to tell us what they think is useful, good, bad, or indifferent, in the context of some kind of specific data. And then when you've heard all of that, we'll open it up to you to comment on anything that you've heard. So with that in mind, I think I'll hand it over to the panel to introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. I'm Caroline Compton-James, Deputy Chief Executive at SCAPE. And it's really great to be in a room where public sector procurement is celebrated. And I hope today we'll be able to explore the value add that procurement can bring, particularly in social value. So for those of you who don't know SCAPE, we are public sector procurement experts. We like procurement. We think it's fun. We think it's creative and innovative. And as a very proudly public sector owned organization, one of our key goals is to drive value for the public sector. And in this particular session, we'll talk about it through social value. For those of you that are digitally inclined, you'll see a QR code upon the screen. Not for looking at now, because hopefully we will grab your attention, but another example of some amazing data and insights that we at SCAPE have worked on in collaboration with the Social Value Portal to provide wonderful insight into construction spend in social value. So a slightly different data set to Gus's. So without further ado, I will hand over to Rob.
Thank you. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Rob Wolfe. I co-founded Chai Consultancy, which in the broadest terms is a social value consultancy with the public and private sector in Leeds in 2006. We have been designing strategies, working with both the public and the private sector and the third sector, delivering. And for my sins, I was also involved in the early days of the measurement of social value and the quantification of social value in terms of financial proxies, etc., and have worked with many of the platforms in the frameworks. For me, it's great to be on this panel. I am slightly obsessed with data, particularly when we come on to the uses and abuses, particularly about people being more open about the data that they use and that level of transparency, which I think is key to any data.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. My name's Tricia Blatherwick. I work for a company called AutogenAI. And what we do is we help organisations tell their stories. And I think data is a really important component of storytelling. I actually think that organisational stories are one of their most important sources of data now. We used to think of data as numbers only. I think data is often individual stories and then aggregated stories about impacts that organisations can make. So hopefully when we talk about data, we'll also be talking about storytelling and the importance of that. I think the other thing that'd be useful to cover in this session is the difference between input data, output data, and outcome data. I think one of the things that a lot of commercial organisations are really bad at is measuring outcomes. I know that was covered this morning in a couple of the sessions, so looking forward to that.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Nathan Goode, Chief Knowledge Officer at Social Value Portal, and yes, I did get to choose my job title. So I look after the TOMS, which is our system of social value measurement, but that sort of goes really quite widely. It's not just about sort of developing a proxy values and financial measurement and for complex things in social value, but actually figuring out how those can be put into practice and best used in a way that is both meaningful and robust. And in my 10 years at Social Value Portal, I've always championed data, and actually I've been telling people today that this is the most important session of the whole day. Right, a guy would maybe disagree with me on that one, but I think it is. I think it's all about the data. So I've always at Social Value Portal said that we have to check the data that our customers and the stakeholders we work with give us on social value. We can't just allow data to go unreviewed, unchecked, and as part of that, I set up our data validation team as a specialist part of the business so that we could do that validation process. So yeah, it's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, actually, let me kind of kick off with that. So I'll start with you, Nathan. The first question is the uses and abuses of data. So you chose your own job title, and it's a good one, and you've set up the data validation team. You're there to make sure that all the data is correct. What would happen if your team were not there?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't think social value would stop, but what that process does is it provides a solid foundation. And at the end of the day, people want to be able to talk about the social value that they're delivering. And what validation does is it gives you that foundation, it gives you that underpinning that you can go and talk to other people with confidence, your stakeholders, your CFO, people outside of the business, people outside of the public sector organization, Where you can't do that, where you're not sure about your data and how well it's been validated, it's difficult to celebrate those stories. So yes, absolutely, it's not just about the numbers, but unless you're confident in the numbers, that undermines the whole narrative around social value delivery.
And is it a lot about just kind of making all of these data sets kind of consistent? I guess what I'm getting at is, when the data's wrong, is it cock up or conspiracy?
It's a great question. We don't think it's generally conspiracy. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that in some cases, organizations might try to game the system, for example, maybe pick particular elements of the TOMS framework to report against versus others because it gives them a higher number. And Anna was talking this morning about the State of the Nation report that we produced, and a lot of this is about transparency. So there were two numbers. Those of you who were kind of watching it closely, you would have seen a number around about 60 million, another one about 32 million, and that 60 was the total number reported. The 32 was the validated number, and before you all go, well, what about the other 28? That's an ongoing process. So if you think about it, you've got data coming in all the time. So data is going to come in. It's not validated at a particular point in time. It will be at some point in the future. So there's always going to be a lag between the two. Now we want to get that validation rate up and higher, but the fact that there's a process there really sort of provides that solidity, if you like, to the whole thing.
Very good. Caroline, over to you. Tell us a bit more about what SCAPE is doing with data at the moment. Don't worry.
If I could just sort of perhaps add a point to Nathan's narrative about data, in terms of cock-up or conspiracy, I think there's also an element of maturity in the market. And what we've all seen as we've looked at our data and developed our understanding of social value is that we've become better, perhaps, at choosing the right measures for the right regions. So our social value benchmarking report breaks the construction data into regions across the United Kingdom, and you see very different outcomes, which I think is really interesting if you think about perhaps local policies, perhaps client drivers, and the value, I think, of the range of the TOMS metrics is choosing the right solution for you as a client. But then, of course, being able to validate the data gives you confidence, and back to Tricia's point about outcomes, is that you are then able to deliver on the outcomes that are right for your particular region, whether it be through work or employment or community or green. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but hopefully I did.
The audience will be the judge of that when they ask their questions at the end. I'll probably keep my microphone, ask you guys to. Rob, Caroline referred to outcomes. If I remember from the prep sessions, I thought that was a kind of trigger word for you. So tell us what you think about data and outcomes.
Well, yes, I suppose I think that, and it was Tricia's point about what we're getting better at and what we're quite good at within the social value sector is actually measuring the input data. So when we look at things like numbers of apprenticeships, numbers of jobs, numbers of volunteering hours, all of those things actually, unless there's context and unless there's actually a follow through into what change that is actually helping to enable within that region, within that company, within that organization, within the UK, then actually is it meaningless? And I think that's the kind of thing that we're really trying to grapple with at the moment, is that if you have, for instance, local authorities, I was chatting to someone this morning actually, the fact that social value is sat so heavily in procurement means that we've been driven down this approach of quantifying the output and the input data. Whereas actually the inclusive growth teams or the economic development teams in local authorities will be measuring things like health inequality and economic inequality and the health and well-being of their communities. Now, a blackboard at home that I have has lots of equations and various things scribbled on it, but I think that connection between the inclusive growth metrics that are being quite well established now, led by people like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and the input data can help us actually start to understand what is having that most impact. And just very briefly on the transparency side of things, is that I think that data is only good enough unless it's been published properly, and the way that data is made up is transparent. So whether that's a financial proxy or whether that's where that data is coming from, and as well context. So I will not forget, I was walking past an organization and they said, we've delivered 10,000 hours of volunteering. I have no idea whether that's good or bad, because it entirely depends on how many people you've got in that organization and what you've done. So data is only as important as the context that you put it in and the outcome it then delivers. And I do believe we can get there, but the resources to make it happen, I think, may sit with AI.
Oh yeah, well, there we go. That was my transition right there. Oh, you stole that, Rob.
I owe you one. Yes. So where do I start? You're absolutely right. I think so the three data clusters I talked about earlier, the problem data set. I think let's start with that. The problem data sets are sometimes unclear. So who defines the problem data sets? It's central government, local government. Let's take one, violence against women and girls, which we know is a massive problem in this country, and for the Home Office and wider government, really important that we tackle it. So you put that into a social value question set. How on earth do you measure the impact of tackling violence against women and girls in the context of maybe a 1 or 2 year government contract? It's impossible. You don't get quick wins in terms of violence against women and girls. You just don't. So I think that problem set, the statistics around, 2 women every week killed by a partner, it's just horrendous. But you're not going to fix that with a set of social value answers from a housing organisation. So I think you've got to frame the problems as short-term problems that can have some easy fixes, and the longer, more entrenched societal problems that we face. And best not to conflate the two. Otherwise, you will just get sticking plasters, and they won't really deliver the long-term societal change that you need. I think the response data, so I'm going to run an apprenticeship program, I'm going to deliver STEM training for women and girls. Again, you've got the real issue of, are you tackling a short-term issue or are you tackling long-term issues? So you can go down the road and paint a new community centre for the Salvation Army or something. That's a short-term fix, and that's very obvious, and you get an immediate benefit from that. That's very different to tackling systemic societal problems. And I think one thing that we need to do, I think as a sector, is understand who's responsible for measuring the longer-term outcomes and responsible for linking those to the inputs that companies are committing to. So I think what I'm trying to say, probably quite clumsily, is you should commit to short and long-term social value efforts, but in short-term contracts, you can't possibly measure the outcomes at that deeper societal level.
I agree with what you've described, and I think an example, if we were to turn to the construction industry, where SCAPE sits very comfortably, is that we see more social value delivered through longer term programs of work rather than small project by project examples. And with that, obviously, comes a little bit more upfront investment and understanding the longer term impact. And the value, of course, of working across a framework like SCAPE is that you can get all of your partners collaborating. And we've got some wonderful examples of our partners. An example in Scotland springs to mind, completely unrelated to a construction project, just coming together through the framework, working collaboratively to deliver social value within the community of Edinburgh, building a warehouse for homeless and food charity, which otherwise wouldn't have happened. So there's value in aggregating, which I think sort of echoes what you were saying.
Okay, very good. I think some interesting points there. There are a few things I'd like to probe on, and actually we've had some quite punchy questions as well, but we'll get to them in a minute. Let me. The clock is ticking. Let me go to the next section, which is seeing how the panel fare when we actually kind of submit a piece of data and ask people to kind of respond to it. So I'll just give a minute of context on this chart since it was produced by my company, Tussell. It is showing 6 years worth of trend data on how much the wider public sector, broken down between central government, NHS, and local government, spent directly with SMEs in procurement. And this is not just across construction, this is across all sectors. So consulting, health and social care, construction, recruitment, everything that is procured. I think there's quite a lot to talk about there, the trend of it, the disparity between some of the different lines. But I'm going to ask a slightly provocative question. I'm going to start with Nathan. If you were presented with this and asked whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, what would you say?
I would probably say I don't know.
Very honest. People don't say that nearly enough.
I think, well, it's to the point that a number of us have been making. Rob made the point about 10,000 volunteering hours, I think. And it's about context. So this is a great jumping off point for a story. And I guess the other point I would make here is people often say it's not just about the numbers; it's about the stories, and that's kind of forgetting that the numbers tell a story as well. So what is the level of spend in local government over this period, for example? So that 28 billion, if let's take that as an example, if overall local government spend has dropped in that period, that's really interesting. If it's gone up higher than that, so is that 28 as a proportion of the total spend? Is it more or less than it was in 2019? SMEs, that's a huge swathe of UK PLC, the UK business sector, right? So are we talking about S's? Are we talking about M's? Are we talking about micro businesses? So it just makes me want to ask more questions, and I think that's not a bad thing. That's a great starting point, and it's that treating this kind of thing not as the end point, but actually as the beginning of a conversation about what's really going on underneath those headlines.
I think that's very fair, actually, as someone who produces quite a lot of it and then is often kind of presenting it both to the public and private sector. I would agree. Data is often seen as a bit of a silver bullet and people think it gives them the answer, but actually usually it just helps them to ask the question. It prompts questions that you wouldn't have unless you were looking at something like this. But Tricia, let me hand it over to you. Good, bad, or indifferent?
I think for me, it's just part of the story. I think the important adjunct to this data set would be the indirect spend with SMEs that is made by central, local, and NHS. Because I think there is a requirement of larger organisations to spend up to 30% of contract revenue where possible with SMEs and VCSEs. So I think I'd add that data set to it to make it more complete. So then that then gives you a truer reflection of how much money is trickling down into the SME community.
Yeah, you're right. It's hard to track that because you're dependent on the primes providing that information, and sometimes they won't, sometimes they can't, sometimes they want to, but they actually struggle to kind of get that from their own kind of
Somebody in the room might know, but I don't know whether that's a new requirement under the Procurement Act to make that kind of declaration of spend with SMEs publicly available. So it might start to become, I know the new Procurement Act is supposed to drive transparency. I don't know whether the transparency of actual spend with SMEs by primes is part of that.
Well, the Procurement Act is meant to do a lot. Whether it is yet living up to those expectations, I feel could be a session in and of itself. I've got a few thoughts on that. But Rob, why don't you tell us how you'd respond to this?
I agree with both Tricia and Nathan. I think it's the beginning of a story. I would argue I am indifferent, if I'm honest, because I don't think that. I think there's a very good point around SMEs. SMEs are up to 250 employees. That's still pretty big. So I think the breaking down of that data and including the supply chains within that, I think what I'd be interested in is where you are seeing people spending more or spending less, and mapping that against different data sets to see if there's any correlation between, if you spend more with SMEs, does that reduce economic inequality, for instance? That's the interesting part for me. And again, I'm afraid that's it's the beginning of a story that I think is the important bit. But I do massively believe that I know that people use social value measures and data to promote and put in an annual report, and I think that's wonderful. I think that's great. But actually, I think we all need to remember that the reason why we measure things and the reason why we collect data is to inform better decisions. So does this set of data help me inform a better decision? Not at the moment, it doesn't. But with the other data, with the questions that we then ask, it can then help us inform better decisions. So I think that whenever we're talking about measurement and data, it's, does this help me make a better decision? And if it doesn't, is it worth collecting?
Not too much more to add. Really good points made thus far. I think in the context of SCAPE and looking at an increase in SME spend, my gut is that that's good, because we all know that a resilient supply chain, a growing supply chain, helps in the delivery of local services. So I'd err on the side of good. Coming back to the point about, do primes or tier ones or big suppliers record SME spend, that is 100% a KPI at SCAPE. And when you read our social value benchmarking report, you will see that the spend has increased there as well. So my initial view would be that this is a good news story, but totally agree, we've got to probe and ask more questions, but also think to what end. What do we want to use this data for? What questions are we answering? I think I'll leave it there.
If I just take the central government direct spend with SMEs, just under 7 billion, but only 11% of the total. I'm going to kind of invite our panelists. I'm not going to nominate one. I'm going to ask someone to volunteer. Is that because the government is not very good at leaning into SMEs, or is that because SMEs are not very interested in leaning into central government? Who wants to take a crack? Tricia, then Nathan.
It probably works both ways, actually. But I had a stat once that I heard, hopefully it's true, which is that roughly 10% of all government procurement notices are marked as suitable for SMEs. But of that 10%, only 10% actually get awarded to SMEs. So you're talking about 1% at the end of the day. I think the transfer of risk is usually unpalatable for an SME. Government departments want to work with SMEs and then ask them to take on a degree of commercial, operational, and other risk that frankly would sink an organisation twice their size. So I think the government hasn't got its head around appropriate transfer of risk, no matter how many Cabinet Office playbooks get produced, trying to tell government procurement teams not to do it. So I do think the mechanisms of procurement, the contractual standards, the model playbook, the model contract that the government uses, all work against SMEs working with government. So sometimes actually it's easier for an SME to work through a prime, even though they may want to contract directly. Sometimes it's a lot easier not to take that primary risk on contracts. So I think that's part of the problem.
Good, thank you, Nathan.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that. I mean, I think the target, there's been a sort of KPI of around about 30%, I think, as a target spend of central government with SMEs. I think it's a great example of a completely meaningless and useless KPI, because it you wouldn't award a giant defence contract to an SME, for example. You might sort of pick particular specialist elements. You might need a tier one to actually wrap the risk, as Tricia's saying, so that an SME can participate. I think it's a distraction actually to have that kind of crude target and not really be thinking about when and how and why should SMEs actually engage directly with central government.
I think, to be fair, the government kind of agrees with you because they've scrapped that that £1 in £3 target. I don't know if everybody kind of clocked that, but it was a central government kind of policy to spend £1 in every 3 of procurement, directly and indirectly with SMEs. The problem was that the government wasn't really measuring the indirect piece, so that kind of, that was a kind of imponderable. And then the second problem with the measurement of the direct spend is that, as everybody can see on that chart, central government wasn't coming anywhere close to spending 1 in 3. It wasn't close, and it wasn't really getting any better. But actually, rather than beat the government with a stick for saying it kind of failed by its own measures, I think it took some courage for the government to say, actually, we tried that, it didn't work, and now we're going to scrap it. And what they've replaced that 1 in 3 with is asking ministerial departments to publish their own targets just on the direct spend. So it acknowledges that no one was measuring the indirect spend, so it shouldn't come into the numbers. I think that's a healthy dose of realism. And secondly, instead of mandating it from the centre, it's asking the departments to publish it themselves. And the departments are taking that so seriously that they're now 4 months late in actually kind of publishing all of those. They were meant to do it in June, and I don't think much is going to come out before Christmas. So a lot of things it's easy to kind of criticise the government for, but I think it's actually quite a welcome example of people trying something, acknowledging it doesn't work, and kind of pivoting. And I think actually sometimes we should acknowledge that, that they're learning from mistakes.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. I mean, that probably tells you that around about 10% is about the right number. Actually, over a 6-year period, it's been pretty constant. So
yeah, it's a really good point. If there was the potential to get much better, there probably would have been evidence. I'll just say 1 or 2 other things about this chart. One of my obsessions in looking at data around the public sector is everybody always bangs on about kind of central government, but actually people always miss the interesting trends going on in local government. And when it comes to direct procurement from SMEs, local government is procuring roughly twice as much in absolute terms, not shy of 30 billion versus 15 billion for central government and NHS combined. So my one question is, how many people in the room knew that local government was spending twice as much directly with SMEs as everybody else put together? And how many people knew that proportionally it was spending 3 times more with SMEs than local government? And I think it is, and that it's been going up during that period, even as procurement spend by local government has been pretty flat. Tricia, I think you've got a point.
Yeah, I just want to fly the flag for not-for-profits and VCSEs. Again, Gus, I'm not sure, people might not be aware, but every government department now has to also report quarterly on progress against their own targets for spend with the not-for-profit sector. Again, I think next week, 30th of October, the new data is coming out on indices of deprivation across the country. And, the organisations that tend to help address societal problems are the not-for-profit sectors. And I think government and commercial organisations need to get a lot better at working with charities, unlocking the value that charities can give to supporting the mental health crisis in this country. Again, I'll repeat, the violence against women and girls in this country. there are a lot of societal ills that charities are really well placed to support. And there are large charities, there are medium charities, and there are micro charities. And there are some in this room, there are some at this conference. And I think we spend a lot of time talking about SMEs. I don't think we spend enough time talking about VCSEs. And there are organisations like Neighbourly, who are downstairs, and other organisations who can match charities to the kinds of societal problems that are being reported in the government statistics on multiple deprivations. So I think we need to look at that as well.
Yeah, I think Caroline had a point, and then we'll move to questions, I think.
As is with every good question, it kind of makes you think about other things. And as you were chatting about the increase in local government spend and the importance of that for a resilient supply chain and SMEs, it made me think about the local government reorganisation and review, and thinking about all the political change that is happening at the moment. Often that can lead to a delay in decision making. So that made me a little bit fearful for the resilience of our SMEs within regions as perhaps decision making gets paused. So one of the things we've been thinking about at SCAPE is how we can continue supporting clients with that decision making and good procurement, long-term programs of work, so that we don't see a negative impact on that economic growth within region.
Yeah. I'm going to just kind of warm us all up by asking a couple of questions that I've had through this through the app. There's a couple of quite punchy ones, and then I think we'll open it up to the audience. Now, Rob, you run a consulting firm, so I'm going to point this question at you because it's about consulting firms.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Well, get ready. It only gets worse from here. The question is: there is a lot of data produced by the public sector, but not a lot of meaningful insight. How do we move from data to insight in the public sector, in brackets, so we don't have to carry on relying on private consultancies to make sense of it for us? So, as someone who runs a private consultancy, Rob,
with a very entrenched social purpose, I would like to say. So when we work, there with the data insights, there are, in fact, we are beginning to see those people, the data analysts, the economists. They need to be within those local authorities, within the contracting authorities, to look at that data and check it against working with the VCSEs in the communities to see whether that makes sense to them. So I think that as far as within the public sector, I think the people are there with the skills to do that. But I think a lot of them end up working in the private sector and then consulting back into the public sector. But if the public sector published, so working with people like the Open Data Institute and various others, what they really pioneered was if they publish the data, then other people can look at that data and they can develop their own insights into that data. But it takes a lot of courage from the public sector to publish all of that data. Then they get those insights and the analytics and everything else for free. And sometimes you get really positive outcomes from it. So one really good example of that was TfL. They published all of the transport data, and suddenly all of those apps that you get to help you transport around London and everything else, that was because TfL published openly all of their travel data. And then the private sector went, that's really interesting. I can now publish this and I can now help people move around London. So I believe that it is transparency and it is about publishing that data, and that's how they could potentially get that insights without having to contract with consultants. And I would like to say we are a micro consultancy. And we were born in the third sector. So I spent much of the last 20 years, I've spent about 10 years of it in the third sector. So we are not a big evil consultancy.
Very good. We're not blaming you, Rob. Okay.
Oh, you can. I'm happy to be.
Okay. I'm gonna ask a similar question to Nathan. So watch out. This one is about the TOMs. And I'm just going to synthesize it a little bit, but it goes something like this. Do frameworks like TOMs risk turning social value into a numbers game where bidders focus more on quantity than quality. So let's hear from the Chief Knowledge Officer on this, please.
Thank you, Gus. Well, yes, is the short answer. There is that risk, and it's something that we're very alive to. Now, the first thing I would say is that it's entirely down to the procuring authority to determine what the balance is between quantitative and qualitative metrics. So we would always see the TOMs as a really good underpinning, a way of signposting and a way of anchoring specific measurable commitments that can then be delivered in a contract. But they are clearly not a substitute for a good qualitative social value bid. So it's all about how you use it. It's all about the way in which you incentivize bidders by the processes that you apply that actually embed the TOMs. It's a criticism that we've had regularly for the last 10 years, and there's still a debate about the how whether or not you should have quantitative tender metrics, and I totally get, for example, that certain things are extremely difficult to predict as a bidder. So we've got measures around employing ex-offenders, for example. How on earth, as a bidder, are you going to know whether or not you can employ an ex-offender in a situation where you actually know very little about the contract at that particular point in time? What we find is that our public sector customers, the ones that are really thinking carefully about this, are kind of navigating that. They're being selective. They're determining how and when and why they use these metrics, and that enables it to get the right balance really between that qualitative and quantitative.
Okay, I think Caroline wanted to make a point, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Well, I wanted to endorse Nathan and the value of the TOMs from SCAPE's perspective. We've been working together producing the social value benchmarking report for 5 years, but with 1,800 live projects on site, 24 delivery partners, a common tool like the TOMs enables us to look at economies of scale, look at trends, that I think if each of our individual clients was using a slightly different tool with a slightly different metric, we wouldn't really be able to look at the themes, the trends, the regional differences. So it's got its place, certainly.
I was going to open up to the audience. A hand has gone up, and someone at the back has a microphone, please.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks very much to the speakers. Rick Fordham, I'm an academic consultant here today representing Libraries Connected. Trying to look at the social value of libraries. But my question is more general to Nathan, if I may. You mentioned the setup of your validation team at the early part of your talk. I just wondered how that team actually does, you can just outline, you don't have to give me the nuts and bolts, but how do you actually go about a validation process? Secondly, if you find a discrepancy between what your client has submitted to you and what you estimate the value is, like the different return on investment, how would you have that conversation with the client? Maybe they've kind of over-egged it a bit?
Yeah, that's two really great questions. And we do have members of our validation team in the audience, but I'm not going to pinpoint them. So when we develop the TOMs, as it's evolved over the years, we've looked very carefully at what we consider to be acceptable evidence requirements for each individual measure within the TOM system. So that essentially gives users of the TOM system a clear list of deliverables that says, in order to validate this data, we need this, this, and this from you. So that's the starting point. Now, for many reasons, some of which are on their end, maybe some of them are on our end as well, and we're all kind of learning as we go. For many reasons, the data comes in maybe without that information, or describing something that doesn't quite fit the the measure that they're particularly reporting against, all sorts of reasons why, particularly in the first instance, and this is very much a kind of iterative process, people don't necessarily get it all right in the way we're looking for. So our team does the review and provides detailed feedback to customers and their suppliers, because if they're public sector customers, it's actually their supply chain that needs to be doing the reporting, and just points out basically where there are discrepancies. And there could be a number of outcomes. It could be simply that the figure gets adjusted because something is incorrectly reported. Could actually be that with further clarification, further information, that figure can be validated, because actually with that additional information it completes the picture. So there's a very clear process for that, and what we're trying to do in that process is create the opportunity for users of the TOM system to review what they're doing and to align the way in which they're reporting with those evidence requirements. Now, that all could be and sounds like quite a big process. So the challenge, of course, is to do that in a way that is workable for businesses and public organizations and third sector organizations. That is a big ongoing challenge, and people may well come and sort of grab me by the collar later and say it's too complicated, it's too hard, it's too messy. And I take all of that on board, because we're kind of learning as we go.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, Nathan, this is coming to you as well. It's about Toms as well. I work for WSP, and I'm the social value lead for my commission. I've been trying to upload some information to get the Toms in, and I keep getting frustrated. First of all, I want to say you guys are doing very good work, because it helps me to put my information straight away, and it works well. But the only one I want to point out is where I need help. So it's not that it's not working; it's working, but I need help with this. So I have these toms, the tom slide that just came up. I have NT1, NT1A, NT1C, and I can't put NT1A and NT1C because it's not available when I click on it. What are you doing to make sure we have all of them?
That is yeah. Should we go out for coffee afterwards? That's a really good idea.
I said, while I have you here, Chief Knowledge Officer, might as well do it here.
So,
all right.
Well, it is kind of product in a way, I suppose. I mean, the TOMS does evolve and develop over time. We produced a new version of the TOM system in 2023, 24. We're actually working on the next iteration of it at the moment in a more global context, but actually that will start to feed back into the UK TOM system as well. My sort of vision and objective for all of this is to retain the robustness of the TOMS, but to really home in on how we make it more accessible, easier to understand, more intelligible, quicker to use, and so on. So I welcome any feedback like that that we can sort of take into account. And yeah, let's go and have a coffee.
I just want to make a plea for the long contracts. So I know there was a National Audit Office report that basically said government was really bad at breaking back open contracts when the real world changed around a particular procurement. And I think the same is true for social value. So I think if you're buying a product or a service with a 5-year or more contract, there ought to be provision in the contracts for you to revisit the social value commitments that have been made, because the world changes, right? And societal problems change and shift. And I don't think that happens at all. So if there's anybody in public sector in the room, or if there's procurement teams in the room, I'd like to make a plea that social value commitments should not be set in stone from day one, but they should be able to be revisited and renegotiated and re-agreed, especially on the longer contracts.
I'll ask a question to the panel, but if anybody from the audience also has a view on this and they'd like to respond, then they're very welcome to do so. This question got quite a few likes online. So clearly people felt quite, don't worry, no, I'm not picking on anyone now. I think actually I'll ask the question and then see who wants to take a swipe at it. So the question is, we know that the same input, for example, number of staff hours spent on social value, can result in wildly different outputs depending on multiple factors, such as community feedback, delivery styles, local needs, and delivery style, it repeats. So the question is, does the focus on recording inputs take away from the need for meaningful outputs? So I'm going to ask Rob if he's got a view on this one, but if anybody in the audience has direct experience of this, then that would be good to hear too.
Yes. Sorry, that's very glib of me. Yeah, I think with regards to outcomes, I think a lot of the time we put that in the too difficult pile. And I think that people kind of want perfection. And I think that whether we're talking about the TOMs in terms of financial proxies, they are proxies. They are not, they are proximities. They are an assumption. They are based on educated assumptions, but they are assumptions. And I think that we can get quite of the way there to looking at the outcome is if we combine outputs. So if I provide an example here, in a very commonly, whether we agree with it or not, a very common theme is apprenticeships, let's say. If we just measure the input, the number of apprenticeships you recruit, that can drive extremely bad behavior where people are sacking. I was working on a project where they said, I can hire 10 apprentices, sack them next week, and I still meet my target. Yes, you can't argue with that. Yes, they would still reach their KPI. But if you then start to add other outputs, are they paid well? Are they paid the real living wage? Do they have sustained contracts once they've completed their qualification? Are they in sustainable employment? Are they POAE contracts? Do they live locally? Do they remain to live locally? Are they then working on other projects? That cluster of outputs actually begins to tell a story, and it begins to tell a story of those outcomes. So as much as I denigrate the input-output sort of challenge, I do think we can get better at clustering outputs to give ourselves a better indicator of an outcome rather than just the headline input, as the person said online. I'd give you that.
First, my name's Adam. I work in the responsible procurement team at the Ministry of Justice, and it's just on the whole input-output outcomes scenario, because I think one of the largest issues in terms of social value is with what's quantifiable and what should be quantitative data, what should be qualitative data, and I think there's a massive disconnect in terms of input data can be quantifiable and can be quantitative because it's a lot easier on paper to understand 10 apprenticeships have been committed to. However, the outcome data is something where you'd get more qualitative information. So we could reach out and we can look into our contracts and see what's being delivered, what outcomes, what impact has it had. But the issue being is it's such a lot with central government. There are so many extra steps. So where the people who start the contract may set up the input data and they're starting it quantitatively, but that may then be handed on to someone else and then down the line, and a lot of the information is sort of lost. So I think my main question is, what would you sort of do around ensuring that there's a sort of a consistency of knowledge on the delivery and the process across things? Because although we could say yes, you can use a tool to record and monitor it, there's not always going to be that one particular focal person who's going to be tracking it. So, and I suppose you'd see with a lot of the data, you're pulling it from lots of different sources. Not everybody, particularly within central government, knows everything about everything.
Well, I've got some views on this, but I'm merely the chairman, so I'm going to hand it over to Nathan, who I think is champing at the bit to respond to that one.
With 5 minutes to go, and I'm sure the rest of the panel have got a view on this as well, I'm going to say something maybe a little bit controversial. I don't think the public sector generally, and there are honourable exceptions, takes data seriously enough. And what you're talking about there is a development, is an evolution over time, so that you can get to a point where, as the Ministry of Justice, you can see what the ultimate impact is of that intervention or that initiative. That doesn't happen tomorrow. You cannot do this unless you invest in data collection and you think about it as a long-term project. And frankly, I think the public sector has historically been terrible at it, and it needs to get better at it. And it's a huge asset that is being wasted at the moment. And I think it's to the point that Rob answered earlier on about consultancies coming back in, and there's no need for that. So I get kind of quite annoyed about this, and I appreciate all the budgetary pressures. And there's a decision made. There's a point in government where somebody needs to be saying, "Look, guys, this is really, really important. This data is important. We need to we need to take this seriously. This is the information age. It has been the information age for the last 2 decades or longer. Just let's get real and do this properly."
Right, I'll be really brief. I mean, the question that you pose to us is so relevant, and it's really important in policy terms. We think about the education shortage in this country. We think about the lack of green skills and wanting to grow the green economy. Being able to map those outcomes right from the moment you set your social value targets is the opportunity to achieve, but it doesn't come without thought, planning, and that long-term investment. And 100% the use of digital and AI in enabling that transformation all needs to be woven in. It's a huge opportunity. And I think the important thing to remember is that your partners are here to help you with that.
I'm like a broken record. I think transparency, I think whatever you're publishing, whatever you're measuring, that can help drive better behavior. Whether it's the Daily Mail test or whether it's what I call the conference test, if you're reporting something, would you stand up in the conference today and say that in front of a crowd and be asked questions about it? That should be the validation and assurance. I think that as a challenge to Social Value Portal and other measurement tools, I agree with you, Nathan, about the public sector, but I also think the tools should stop thinking about metrics vertically and start thinking about metrics horizontally. So how do we build up those metrics horizontally rather than vertically? And I can't remember my last point. Oh yes, my last point was if anybody can help to join up the sort of the economic development measures and data sets and open data sets and the social value measures, I'm around, and I would love to be able to bring a group together to actually look at that and actually get something done.
2 points. I haven't really pushed the AI agenda, but I'm going to do so in my final talk. I think that the opportunity AI gives to join up disparate data sets, whether it's cross-departmental central government or whether it's local authorities and their various divisions, and the information that is being sourced from on-the-ground organisations delivering frontline services, I think that is a new capability set, and local authorities need to understand the power of that technology. I think Liverpool has appointed the very first local authority chief AI officer, and other local authorities need to follow suit. The other thing I would say, just following on from the question just now, I think that read across from bid stage to delivery stage, and the fact that things get handed over. What did you say you were going to offer in the bid, and then the operational team go, "God, we've got to deliver that." It has to start at the top. So I think senior sponsorship, I think stop hiring clever grads as your only source of social value input, make it a proper profession, train people properly. Yes, get in your clever grads, but give them professional development support and make your entire senior team responsible for different aspects of social value that your organisation can deliver. And only that way you're going to get anybody bothered about it, I think.
Just quickly, I mean, just to echo Rob's point, and I'm definitely up for this, I think the valuable time could be spent not on arguing about the relative merits of different ways of measuring social value and valuing social value. It's actually in standardizing and open accessing more of the data, the underlying data, and that will drive good practice.
Okay, which just leads me to wrap up. Thank you very much for giving us your attention for the last hour in this hot, airless, stuffy room. I think we've all survived. And thank you very much to Caroline, Rob, Tricia, and Nathan. Thank you. I hope you'll come up to any of them afterwards this afternoon if you see them hanging around. Thank you.